First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the court hold. It's wonderful that we're beginning to have a larger program of in-person events, and it's wonderful to see you all in 3D. So I'd like to thank the court hold for hosting us this evening. Thank all of our speakers, of course, and also the Research Forum for making this all possible, as well as Sophia, who's helping us with the tech. And so far, knock on wood, tech is working. We have via Zoom 2 Ukrainian speakers, but let me first introduce Christina Crawford, and then I will introduce before their talks our other speakers this evening. Professor Crawford will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will bring Elena, who's in Kyiv right now, and Katarina, who's in Kharkiv, to give us a more up-to-date situation and also their input on the situation in Ukraine today. But I'm delighted to welcome my dear colleague from the US, Professor Christina Crawford, who is an architectural and urban historian, as well as a trained architect and assistant professor of assistant professor of architectural history at Emory University. Her research focuses on the transnational exchange of ideas about housing and urban form in the 20th century. She has a new book out, Spatial Revolution, Architecture and Planning in the Early Soviet Union, which explores the foundations of early Soviet urban theory and practice through 3 seminal industrial sites: Baku, Magnitogorsk, and Kharkiv. Tonight we'll hear about Kharkiv. I'm really excited about this. I would also point out this book is available for free as a downloadable PDF, very much through the generosity and work of Professor Crawford herself, as well as external grants that made that possible. So if it is possible for you to buy the book in hard copy, you will be able to do that, but also for students out there, you can also just download it as a PDF. And I really hope that this kind of open source for an exchange of ideas in kind of an ever more kind of crucial interconnected world that will be possible. So I want to also say tonight is a fundraiser for 2 really important of the many important groups who have come together and sprung into action as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're really excited to have you support through a digital donation, either the Kharkiv School of Architecture, which you may know has made the decision to remain in Ukraine. They had plenty of offers to leave the country. It is a crucial institution training architects on the ground, as it were. They have moved to safety in Lviv, but that means they are in absolutely temporary housing. They have really important scholarship program for really excellent students. And I think really supporting on the ground where we can in Ukraine is going to be really crucial to the future. Also, the Kharkiv and Shemeshel project, which we have, is also a grassroots, 100% humanitarian effort that is between the city of Kharkiv. We have 2 representatives, our own court hold, Masha Elena and Ada Kat, who were on the ground at Shemeshel, and also others from the project, on the ground, giving aid in 2 crucial junctures. People who are left behind in Kharkiv who could not go because they are have mobility issues or other reasons, so providing crucial food and medicine. And then also in Shemeshel, the massive point just over the border in Poland. So donate a little to both, or choose your own. It's like those tokens in the grocery store. You can either one, and we'll put that on at the end as well. Following the presentations, we'll also open the floor to Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to very much welcome Professor Crawford.
Just in terms of logistics, I'm sure everyone 2+ years into the pandemic knows how these work. You just put your camera up and okay. My parents wouldn't necessarily know how to do that. So thank you so much to the court hold, and particularly to my longtime friend, Dr. Robin Schuldenfrei. So Robin envisioned this event and worked tirelessly to organize every detail. So as she mentioned, my lecture will be about 40 to 45 minutes and will be followed by short talks from my Ukrainian colleagues from Kyiv and Kharkiv. So I'm going to focus in this talk on the architecture and planning of early Soviet Kharkiv. And I'll deeply situate you in the historical and economic context of the USSR in the 1920s and 30s. So I'm now a historian of architecture and planning, but I began my career as a practicing architect and urban designer. So the questions I ask in my scholarship are certainly inflected by my time as a practitioner. So namely, I'm interested broadly in how designers operate in transitional times, like the early Soviet Union, or in my new research of the American New Deal. So in these unstable times, experimentation, research, and precedent sharing in design is particularly robust. And I think you'll see that here. So this image that's from the background now is from 1929. It's just outside of the city of Kharkiv, which was at that time the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war, you likely now know where the city lies, in the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, this aerial of a Жилкомбинат, or living combine, is an aspirational drawing. So you can see the airplane sweeping in from the upper right there. It also happens to be quite accurate to the final built version. Now, I love studying architectural production in this period because of the breathtaking sense of possibility that this drawing encapsulates. So the story that I'll tell is about the Kharkiv tractor factory and its socialist city. And it investigates how this modernist Ukrainian site became implicated in the massive Soviet industrialization drive in the late 1920s. The architectural tactics employed here, namely intense architectural and urban design standardization, significantly impacted Soviet development for then 50 plus years to follow. So on the first day of the war, February 24th, 2022, a missile landed on the playground of the socialist city that I'll speak with you about today. And the windows were blown out of the 6-story housing bar that's in the middle. To bring the destruction and horror even closer to home, Katarina, who you will hear from shortly, is a resident of this neighborhood. So it's a site that's again implicated in Moscow's expansionist efforts, and you should know its story. So the Kharkiv tractor factory is one of just 3 industrial sites that I write about in my new book, Spatial Revolution. So to set this up, I want to just explain how Kharkiv is situated within a broader story about the foundations of Soviet architecture and planning in the early 1920s through the middle of the 1930s. So to do that, I'm just going to lay out the 3, not only 3, but 3 important arguments of the book. So first, argument number 1 is that existing historical scholarship on Soviet architecture favors the Soviet capital of Moscow and the speculative. So on the top are some of what I would call the canonized books in my subfield. From 1970s through the mid-1990s. And below are a wonderful new slate of books that have been published just in this last year, 2021-22. So this collection focuses, perhaps not surprisingly, on Moscow avant-garde architecture, largely in the 1920s. Architecture that was radical, exciting, though in many cases unbuilt. I love the projects in these pages, to be very clear, but most of them remained immaterial. So instead, I focus on the architecture that was built. So on the left, we see the digging of foundation pits by the Red Army on the Kharkiv site. And on the right, the 6-story housing blocks filled with so-called living cells for the tractor factory workers. This architecture was socially and formally radical in its time, but what renders it remarkable is that it was built at all under extremely difficult economic circumstances, which leads me to argument 2, or point 2. So the second argument is that early Soviet architectural production was inextricably tied to specific economic conditions. Not all socialist economies are the same. In the period that I look at, the Soviet Union passed through the new economic policy, or NEP, and so 24 to 32 is basically the kind of temporal bounds of my study. And what I'm showing you on the bottom is a timeline of all sorts of things going on that I've made, but we want to focus on the bottom, which is the specific economic periods. So from 21 to 28 was the NEP, a sort of hybrid socialist capitalist economic system. And then we moved from 28 to 32 into the first 5-year plan, which was Stalin's hyper-industrialization drive and consolidation and centralization of the socialist economy. So each of the sites that I write about was critical to the Soviet economy, and each marks a different economic moment within this 8-year period. So Baku, if I do this, there, you can sort of see that, yeah. So Baku, to the south here in present-day Azerbaijan, was an oil city. And it was planned during the NEP, when there was very little construction elsewhere, but where oil extraction pushed replanning early. Once the first 5-year plan began in 1928, construction took off in other parts of the Soviet Union. Magnitogorsk in the Urals to the east here was really sort of begun in the beginning of the first 5-year plan. And Kharkiv, where we will kind of focus our energies to the east, is an end of the first 5-year plan project. So the point here is to get at what was built, it's important to be aware of economic limits and allowances that affect architectural production. So my third argument is that while experimental work on urban planning and worker housing was a transnational phenomenon. While Spatial Revolution focuses on the 3 Soviet industrial cities that you see highlighted here, I came to understand that the project was actually much larger than this and exceeded even the massive territory that was the USSR. So a faithful mapping of the book doesn't look like this, it looks like this. So due to common economic and political concerns worldwide after World War I, debates about architecture's role in societal reconstruction crossed geographical boundaries. Worker housing, for instance, was widely discussed in this period as a program that needed to exceed the kind of atomized residential unit. So sleeping, eating, procreating, child rearing, playing, cleaning, shopping, going to the doctor, these were all programs that were determined in this era to be essential elements of the residential package that, when you consider them all together, led to the rise of innovative new housing strategies. So through exchange, precedent sharing, and debate on such issues, each of these sites, from Magnitogorsk to Long Beach, California, ended up in the book. But for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on Kharkiv. So the body of the talk proceeds in 4 parts. So first, I'll introduce you to the city of Kharkiv when it served as the first Soviet Ukrainian capital. Architecture was called upon to establish the city's role as a new socialist metropolis filled with intellectuals and skilled labor, and adjacent to the important commodities of grain and coal. Second, I'll discuss the late-breaking decision during the first 5-year plan to construct a tractor factory on the city's outskirts. Architectural standardization was employed to bring the new factory online in record time. Third, I described the design for a socialist city called New Kharkiv, built adjacent to the tractor factory, that too employed architectural standardization for housing, social service, buildings, and even repeatable urban blocks to swiftly house the tractor factory workers. And then last, I'll consider briefly how the planning innovations on the Kharkiv tractor factory site in 1930 ramified throughout the Soviet era, particularly in the 1960s, when standardized mass housing finally took root. So I argue that standardization tactics deployed at the new Kharkiv socialist city empowered the Soviet government to quickly construct and then internally colonize far-flung sites across the Eurasian continent. So the larger argument that I'm making here, and you'll have to kind of follow me along kind of intellectually, it's very much, it's an architectural argument. And that in the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet system harnessed the design tools of standardization and mass production that emerged in industry, moved into architecture, and then finally into planning. So we have as an expansion from the tractor to the factory, to mass housing, and then finally into planning. To mass housing and to repeatable urban units. So this final stage, urban standardization, that we have all the way over to the right, is what made Soviet expansion across the continent possible. And I'll return to this point at the very end. So to begin with the context. So Kharkiv is located in the eastern part of Ukraine. You can see the sort of pink dot with the white outline there. It's about 32 kilometers or 20 miles from the Russian border. The Bolsheviks claimed Kharkiv the capital of Soviet Ukraine as early as December of 1917, while Kyiv, the former imperial era capital, stood as the contesting administrative center of the Ukrainian People's Republic. When the dust settled in the aftermath of the Civil War, Kharkiv became the sole capital of Soviet Ukraine. So from 1922 to 1934, it's 12 years as the sole capital. Post-revolutionary Kharkiv proved an excellent site to test socialist spacemaking and iconography. The city had an expanded political role, and its population and industry increased precipitously. So what I'm showing you here, this 1932 chart plots 12 categories of growth in the city from 1913 to 1932 and projects their continued rise into the late 1940s. So I look at this and I see construction, right, as an architect. So construction of new governmental buildings, housing, hospitals, schools, and modern infrastructure was needed. And the Soviet state seemed poised to provide them. The historical parts of the city are at the confluence of these two rivers right here. To the north, a new administrative center was planned. And here's the site of what is now called Freedom Square, or Ploshcha Svobody, which is, by the way, the 8th largest city center square in Europe. And I want you to note over here, this kind of complex of buildings on the lower left of this photograph. So architecture was a main tool to establish socialist state building iconography. In 1925, an all-union competition was held for the design of the first and most prominent governmental building in Kharkiv, the Держprom, or the state's industry building. And this was the building that we just saw holding that kind of one end of that massive plaza. The building's compositional liveliness, I think you can sort of get a sense of it here, is due to its variable massing from 6 to 12 stories. At the ground, the building splits into 3 parts to allow 2 of the 5 radiocentric streets that spring from the foregrounding plaza to sneak under the building. The buildings are then reconnected by skyways at various levels to visually represent cooperative collaboration in concrete and glass. These photos, by the way, by a British art critic and travel writer, Robert Byron, are in the Courtaulds collection, as are these. Now, so just to pull back for just a minute and just be very clear what characterizes architectural constructivism. So compositionally, we have unadorned geometric massing, dynamically composed, and like other strands of modernist architecture, a preference for steel and glass. And the look, if not the actuality, of smooth concrete surfaces. Many of these buildings, I don't know about the post office here, but many of these buildings are in fact masonry buildings that are parged to kind of look monolithic and concrete. But what's critical to understand is that strict constructivist practitioners, architectural practitioners, were not primarily concerned with aesthetics. What mattered was not what the building looks like, but what it does. So in this building, the Central Post Office, which still exists, the function is to handle the mail, and the plan does it beautifully. But the buildings also has a responsibility to communicate information to the populace. So we have a clock, we have clear sans serif signage, and this column of glass at the stair that visually speaks to the bustle of interior movement day and night. And the reason that I make this distinction is that, you know, constructivist architects in the 1920s, like Moise Ginsburg, who I won't mention again, but important constructivist architect, would be spinning in his grave to hear constructivism referred to as a style. So we have to be very, very clear about kind of what their preoccupations were. Many other constructivist buildings, including copious multi-unit housing projects, were built before the capital was transferred to Kyiv in 1934. Now you can't see it because of the Zoom stuff up there, but but you can see the address on the lower left there. Before moving on, I just want to celebrate this phenomenal website and guide to the constructivist built heritage in Kharkiv that was created by a group of Ukrainian architectural historians and practitioners, including Katarina, who will be speaking in a little bit. The guide map alone that you can see on the bottom there is absolutely priceless. Many of the buildings that are on this map have been damaged by Russian shelling, but the historical work that these web pages hold will be an incredible resource once reconstruction begins. And you know, when tourism in Ukraine picks up again, this is where you need to go. Okay, so on to industrial standardization and expansion, the factory. During the first 5-year plan, which again was from 1928 to 32, and really all of a sudden, the Soviet government pumped massive state funding into industrial projects. So each icon on this map, and this is a projective map, so this was the kind of desired outcome of the first 5-year plan. But each of these icons was to be a new or existing yet expanded industrial site that would be constructed during the plan. This is an absurdly enormous undertaking, just to be very, very clear. Now, many of the locations earmarked for heavy industry were undeveloped sites of mineral wealth, far removed from existing transportation infrastructure. So under these circumstances, architectural standardization, by which I mean not only the use of standard building types, as we'll see, but also a kind of centralized design process, these became key components of Soviet national planning and industrial development. These kind of pop-up industrial complexes, which was a purview of American expertise, jibed with Soviet aspirations to rapidly develop these far-flung production sites. And to orient you, on the left, we have the Western section of the Soviet Union, and on the lower right, the Eastern part of the Soviet Union. They're completely different scales. So we can see there's a hierarchy here, right? And even the cartography. So as we'll see, the Kharkiv tractor factory provides a view into these kind of early stages of architectural standardization in the USSR. The ambitious timetable set by the state's economic planners simply did not allow for a period of internal architectural research and development. Industrial architecture was already well established in the US at that time. So what I'm showing you here is Ford's River Rouge plant outside of Detroit, a project that was very well known to and frequently visited by Soviet industrial planners. So pragmatism, forced by this self-imposed absurd schedule, led the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy to Albert Kahn, the architect of Henry Ford and the Rouge. And Kahn is seen here on the upper left. He's the one looking at the camera with the mustache. Now, Kahn's firm was contracted by the Soviet government to design a single tractor factory for Stalingrad that I'm showing you here. So this whole architectural a construction set was made in Detroit and shipped to the Soviet Union, as well as all of the pieces to build this factory. Now, the architectural types like the forge shop that I'm showing you here were already tried and tested in US projects, and they were slightly adjusted for Soviet conditions. In Kahn's archive at the University of Michigan sits this construction administration scrapbook. It's really amazing. Provided to him, of course, by his Soviet clients. And it's what we call a construction administration book. So, so they were taking photographs kind of as the construction went along, sort of putting them in these binders and then sending them on to Detroit. Now the project was a success, and it led to a 2-year agreement between the Soviet government and Albert Kahn, Inc., making the Detroit design firm consulting architects for all industrial construction in the USSR for a period of 2 years. So back to Kharkiv. From the 1880s, Kharkiv was the logistics center of mining in the eastern Ukrainian region, and the administrative center of the Donetsk industrial basin. So this map, which you should now recognize, underscores the importance of this region to the Soviet industrialization drive. There are only 3 sites that merit maps at a larger scale: Leningrad, Moscow, and the Donetsk basin. But perhaps most importantly, the grain harvested in the Ukrainian architectural heartland just beyond Kharkiv's borders was sold on international markets to fund these heavy industrial projects. So you need to hold on to this fact that grain was the primary Soviet export that made the construction promised in this entire plan possible. Tractors, about which I know way too much now and did not anticipate learning about to this degree. They were a critical piece of machinery necessary to meet the grain extraction goals that the plan required. They were not nearly enough, and most were in fact imported from the United States. So this charts, and this was going through many different kind of archival documents and the like. So I was able to chart the projected tractor production increase just for Kharkiv over the year of 1929. So again, this is projected. So, they began sort of, wishing for a certain number, and by the end, it was clear that they needed many more. Now, from January to December of 1929, the tractor targets increased by 500%. So Kharkiv's small existing tractor factory couldn't keep up. Another bigger factory needed to be built. Oh, shoot. Well, some of the stuff didn't come through. There was supposed to be some highlighting there. Now, in November 1929, a memorandum was drawn up by the regional industrial planners on the choice of Kharkiv as the site for the construction of a new southern tractor factory. The report opened with a list of preconditions for the factory, which included the guarantee of a 15-month construction period and assurance that a full production of 50,000 tractors would be met in 2 years' time. So this timeline left a scant 7 months to prepare the drawings, to prepare the site, and the labor pool for the construction of this factory and the adjacent residential settlement, or sotsgorod, or socialist city. Again, this is just like an unbelievable timeline. Miraculously, the factory was more or less completed on that breakneck schedule. How? Architectural standardization. So the plan was to copy Kahn's Stalingrad tractor factory on the left, exactly for Kharkiv on the right, as that was the only way that this schedule could be met. And here you have to just do the intellectual work to flip this 180 degrees. But in truth, so even though the plan is exactly the same, but there were some alterations that had to be made, including going from kind of steel construction to concrete construction. It's a much longer story for another day. But for our purpose here, I want to simply note that this massive complex was able to begin production of tractors so swiftly because the factory itself was the product of architectural standardization. And you can just get a sense of the scale of it here. I mean, you know, as far as the eye can see, tractor factory. So again, the sort of, you know, the march here. So the lessons of assembly line mass production of the object, the tractor, were assumed and implemented to the production facility itself, the factory, with the help of American industrial architects and engineers. Now in total, Albert Kahn's office records confirm that 531 factories based on their drawings and specifications were completed in the USSR by the time the 2-year consultancy was over. 531 in 2 years. So this is what I like to call the Albert Kahn world domination map. And you can see, of course, you know, I mean, these are the projects that you know, the office claims for its own. There were many, many, many more. And in fact, the number of unconfirmed facilities based upon plans or details developed by Kahn's office is likely much higher, in the thousands. So let's see how the lessons of architectural standardization learned from the factory then impacted the design of Soviet worker housing in Kharkiv, in the so-called socialist city, or sotsgorod, built adjacent to the factory. The industrial residential settlement was called New Kharkiv. The whole complex was built 10 kilometers outside of the city center on this main long haul train line to the southeast of the city. So here's the sort of concentric, you know, kind of traditional urban core of Kharkiv to the west. And then here's the train line kind of running like this. And here will be the tractor factory and the sotsgorod. So the factory that you can see in the dashed line on the top, and then the sotsgorod, which is on the bottom and dashed line. They were designed by separate teams and ran on different schedules. The New Kharkiv sotsgorod project was assigned to the Ukrainian architect Pavlo Aloshin, who, with a team of young designers, produced the project with incredible speed. The plan's distinctive form marks it as one of the only constructed examples of the theoretical model known as the Soviet linear city. And I have to just pause, and we're going to sort of move on to the sotsgorod and the work of Alyoshin, the architect. And I just have to give a shout out to Elena who you'll hear from in a bit, who is a specialist on Alyoshin and who was the one who directed me to the archive that became so incredibly useful for my own work. So the linear city's main proponent, former Commissar of Finance of the Russian Republic, Nikolai Milyutin, stressed that new socialist settlement should be organized according to industrial principles. He wrote that A flowing functional assembly line system is the absolutely necessary basis for the new planning. The residential sector of the settlement must be set up parallel to the productive zone and must be separated from it by a green belt or buffer zone. This productive strip must be no less than 500 meters wide. And again, pause for a second, just to kind of walk you through what this is. So the entire system is predicated on linear transportation infrastructure. So you start with the train line, which is on the bottom. Right next to the train line is the production zone, the factory zone. Then you've got the green belt, which acts as the kind of lungs of the project. So if any kind of stray industrial particulates kind of get blown toward the residential zone, they'll be kind of filtered out purportedly by the green zone. Then you've got the residential zone, the housing, and then Park River, kind of nature beyond. And the winds, as you should note, are always blowing in the right direction, right? As if you could control that. So the idea here was that each worker had a short 10 to 20 minute walk to work from his residential unit to the factory. And this green zone also structured rational linear growth of these sectors in either direction along its length, while maintaining this optimal distance between them. This kind of linear growth was also kind of conceptually virtually boundless. So you can imagine sinuous lines of development kind of snaking through Soviet territory. This was a kind of a strange archival find, and I can't tell you anything more about it than what I will tell you right now. But this shows Kharkiv, the center of Kharkiv right here. These are the boundaries of the city. This is our tractor factory over to the right. And at one moment, there was an idea to make these linear cities a kind of corona of linear cities all around the city, as you can see. And to the best of my knowledge, the one that I'll show you is the only one that was built. Now, an early version of the socialist city plan reveals this exact layering of program, except again, you have to flip in your mind 180 degrees. So it's divided into parallel zones, heavy rail to the north, which actually is running kind of like this, like that. With a sort of tentatively penciled factory just below it, exactly 500-meter green band with local transportation corridor, the sort of tram that goes into the center of the city. And then lastly, the residential settlement composed of repeated blocks marching south from the green strip, and then faintly but insistently eastward to kind of colonize the countryside. And a close look at a much more contemporary aerial of New Kharkiv. Now, to be clear, this is before Russian bombing of the city and the site. Shows that it was built really as planned. So we've got the 5 linear zones down to an exactly 500-meter green zone that are still legible in the urban fabric. It's really a remarkable urban artifact. From 1929, 1930, this is the only time that this was sort of considered a sort of feasible urban type. Now, the socialist city, or Sotsgorod, was the name of the entire residential area across from the factory. It was composed of these repeatable blocks known as living combines, or zhilkombinati. So in this close-up of 5 blocks, you can see that they're just 3-block designs mirrored about the center line that I've given you in yellow here. And each held a limited number of housing and social service building types. Each living combine was designed to hold 2,500 residents and accommodate all their basic needs. So kindergartens, schools, worker clubs, and small shops were built into the block along with the housing. So the socialist city was the name for the entire composition, all living combines together to reach a population of 25,000 to 50,000 total residents. The architectural language and constituent elements of the housing combine are articulated in this bird's eye perspective that you now have seen. So in the front and the foreground, you have two narrow 6-story bars that hold dormitory style living cells for singles. Behind are 6 4-story bars that hold multi-room family units. So here are the living cell buildings, here are family units. Here in the middle is the kind of round-nosed workers' club that's attached to communal dining hall and mechanized laundry. And then at the back of the block are these 4 identical educational buildings, so kindergartens, nurseries. Shops, clinics, cinemas, recreational facilities were also built into some of these blocks. So the plans of the tallest, those 6-story tallest housing types show what the individual units were like. And again, they were called living cells. So they were 6 square meters, or about 64 square feet. And you know, basically, you know, it's you come in, there's a little foyer with a sort of sink to wash your face and sort of tidy up. And then it's on, you know, into the living part of the unit as well. You'll notice, if you can read plans here, so it's a shared bath facility here. There were also common areas where you could sort of gather and chit chat, I guess. Whenever I show these to my American students, they say it's a dorm. Like, oh, okay, yes, it's a dorm. So like a dormitory. And here, this is from a different project. This is from a Stalingrad competition. But I think if you look on the far right, it's a little bit easier to understand kind of how the furniture would have worked in one of these. So again, you sort of, you know, you kind of come into the foyer area. Here's your little sink. There's a kind of, you know, a bed right there. Perhaps a little desk where you do your edifying reading against the window. But otherwise, you are, you know, you're working, you are eating in the canteen, you are recreating in the workers' club. So your life is lived really in the public realm. So you don't need much private space, is the theory. Anecdotally, we know that the living cells were not popular. Walls were knocked down to make family apartments. Hot plates were smuggled in to the kitchenless units. So again, you should note there is no kitchen here. And that was by design. But the social infrastructure was successful and it persisted through the Soviet era. Now, where the residential buildings were austere here, the architecture of social programming was what I would call exuberant. And this is because the residential and the social were understood as a kind of integral package and in balance with one another. Kindergartens and workers' clubs were allowed to be architecturally idiosyncratic because it was their job in the urban unit to communicate the dynamic potential of communality. So here we see that the lessons learned from factory standardization impacted the design of mass-produced housing types. Now, in the book, Kharkiv is the final site that I write about, and I largely paint it as an architectural success story for the reasons that are embedded in this diagram that I've made. I also want to be clear, however, that it's important to temper assignation of success to this project. Recent events also demand full historical contextualization. So outside of the high brick wall that surrounded the factory, each entrance of which was guarded by a soldier with a loaded rifle and a fixed bayonet, was manufactured famine and genocide of the Ukrainian peasantry, known as the Holodomor, or the terror famine. So as you recall, grain grown in the Ukrainian countryside was earmarked as the primary Soviet export to fund capital projects like the Kharkiv tractor factory. But the peasants, most of whom ran small-scale subsistence farms, resisted by retaining their harvested grain. So economic sort of export projections that were built into the economic model for the industrialization drive became untenable. So as the historian Moshe Levine put it, the great risk to the Soviet state was that the countryside, if not properly controlled and mastered, could wreck the whole effort. So forced agricultural collectivization turned Kharkiv into a haunted city from 1932 to 34, overpopulated by peasants whose villages were subsumed in a now collective territory. They drifted into Kharkiv, hoping to secure food, and instead many were rounded up by police and carted so far out of town that they could not return for exhaustion. The Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute has mapped, has a remarkable project and a remarkable site on which they've mapped various data points from the Holodomor in their great fan project. So I'm just going to share two maps from that project. This first one shows the blacklisted entities and districts in the country that suffered most during the period the tractor factory was being completed. They're throughout the country, as you can see, but here we see Kharkiv. And then the second is this absolutely devastating map that quantifies Soviet Ukrainian deaths during the 2-year period of the Holodomor. So 4.5 million famine losses, a number that's composed of 3.9 million excess deaths and 0.6 million lost births. So these numbers should boggle the mind. And again, to be clear, this was a manufactured famine to force the peasantry into compliance with Soviet agricultural collectivization. Now, my point in sharing this information and to talk about Soviet architectural history is to make clear that Ukraine has been materially, physically impacted by conjectural choices from politicians from Moscow before. And also that as an architectural historian, I feel ethically obligated to interrogate the context that gave rise to my objects and sites of study, to go outside of the walls. Now I'll conclude by pulling out just one more time to discuss the implications of Soviet design standardization on the continental scale. Now, the Soviets were at pains to remind world leaders and their own population that the USSR constituted a full 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. That territory was only useful, however, if harnessed. So the immense natural resources and vast territories had to be reached and settled. This task was one of the main drivers of the first 5-year plan for industrialization. So the more I kind of thought about this and worked on this, I came to believe that the plan was in effect a colonizing effort to take control of this landmass. So if each icon here is an industrial settlement, how do you quickly populate these dots on the map? Standard urban units. So in the end, I see the first 5-year plan as the primary means to understand how architects and planners became implicated in what historian Timothy Snyder and many others have deemed the internal colonization of Soviet territories that of course expanded Russophone industrialization efforts to the north, to the south, and to the east. So we reached the end of the standardization line from tractors to territory. The logic of these pre-designed urban units quickly installed in nearly any condition was the answer to the Soviet desire to settle and also make productive the land under its control. So the desire to replicate industrial concerns and residential quarters quickly across these vast territories was fulfilled through interscalar standardization of architectural details, building types, and then these settlement modules. The project to control territory and settle the Soviet population in dispersed patterns came to fruition kind of throughout the 20th century, but especially after Stalin's death. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who, by the way, was a housing specialist, he initiated a massive push to standardize and mass produce residential buildings and neighborhoods. So the concrete panel high-rises that became synonymous with Soviet bloc housing was I believe, a continuation of the standardization and dispersion efforts of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Now, the housing, as you know, just kind of visually, was constructed from a very limited number of types. But the neighborhood, too, was a packaged unit, replicable throughout Soviet territories. The living combine was renamed the microregion, or mikrorayon, but the basic form and the principles of self-sufficiency were the same. So to finish back in Kharkiv, this is the Saltivka region, the microregion in the northeast section of Kharkiv. It's one of just many post-Stalinist microregions built as the city continued to expand. And I'm showing you, so here's Saltivka right here, but you can see, I mean, once you know what these are, you can go to a Google map, right, or aerial view, and you right away, you know, like microregion, right? You just, these kind of repeated units, kind of towers in the park, surrounded by green space. So these dense neighborhoods, or mikrorayoni, explicitly civilian areas are, of course, the repeated targets of Russian shelling in Kharkiv. And certainly you've seen images like this from throughout the country as the Russian forces seek to destroy the very possibility for Ukrainians to remain in their homes. So I hope that now you can see that standardized residential buildings just like these throughout Ukraine are the progeny of a near century-long drive toward architectural standardization in the Soviet sphere. This is a legacy that will need to be rebuilt massively and with significant international financial support once the war is over. So, to conclude, I, of course, encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. These, as Robin mentioned at the top, are the two organizations we chose to recommend for this event. The Kharkiv School of Architecture is training these future Ukrainian architects who will have this as their task to do the rebuilding. And if you want to support direct humanitarian efforts, consider Kharkiv. And yes, they're sort of colleagues out, Masha Milieva, who you should speak with if you want to learn more about that. And if you're drawn to read the book, you can find it through Cornell University Press. If you use this code, you can even get further discounts, but it's also open access. So you can download it in one click. Please do and read it, and let me know what you think. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Elena Mukursova to share her screen. I'll stop this sharing and see if you'll be able to share. Hello, Elena. I will just briefly introduce Elena. She's a Ukrainian architectural historian and preservationist based in Kyiv. She holds a PhD in the field of museology and cultural heritage with a thesis on the cultural heritage of Kyiv and the context of the history of 19th and early 20th century architectural competitions. She's a member of the Ukrainian branch of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS, and the Modern Architectural Preservation Organization, DACOMOMO. For 25 years, she has been engaged in archival and field research of Kyiv's 19th and 20th century historical buildings. Since 1997, she has been the chief specialist of the Monument Accounting Department of the Kyiv Scientific and Methodological Center for the Protection, Restoration, and Use of Monuments.
Dear colleagues and dear friends, good evening. It was unexpected for me to receive an invitation to this presentation, but it was nice, and I am grateful to my colleagues, Robin and Christine. And I'm happy to say a few words. First of all, it's very nice that more people will know Pavel Alyoshin's name. This architect is the main character of my research. I have been studying his biography for more than 20 years, and he is one of the most famous Ukrainian architects. I always say Pavel Alyoshin combined two different epochs with his life and talent, Tsarist Russia and Soviet Union. The architect provides himself in different styles: Neoclassicism, Art Nouveau, Bauhaus, Art Deco, so on. Alyoshin had lived in this apartment building for 30 years. He designed and built it himself. This happened almost at the same time as the architect was working in Kharkiv. His descendants had lived in Alyoshin's apartment for many years, and in the early 2000s wanted to create an apartment museum. Unfortunately, it was failed. During the Second World War, Alyoshin stayed with his family in Kiev and survived the Nazi occupation. And immediately after the liberation of Kiev, he started working as a restorer. His team and he restored the building of Kiev University and also joined the project to rebuild the Mariinsky Palace. Unfortunately, the architect failed to restore one of the best houses in Kiev and Sofia Square. He designed and built this apartment house for his father in the style of Ukrainian neo-Baroque. In 1931-33, the central street of Kiev, Khreshchatyk, and many neighboring streets were destroyed. After the war, 2 rounds of the competition for Khreshchatyk's construction took place, and Pavel Alyoshin with his team won the 2nd prize of this competition. Architectural monuments in Ukraine were destroyed in different periods. History has developed in such a way that very few monuments of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance have survived. During the years of Stalinism, churches and manors were actively demolished. During war, architecture also suffered greatly. In Soviet period, historic housing in the absence of private property ownership were poorly maintained. And independent Ukraine has inherited these problems from the Soviet era. But in the post-Soviet era, the system of protection and restoration of monuments faced new challenges. It turned out that private property alone does not solve the problem. Private owners want to make extra money from their property. Restoration is expensive and don't produce quick profits. In addition, unscrupulous owners are almost never punished for their destruction or negligence, although there are laws intended to prevent it. However, a lot of architectural structures remain in state or city ownership, but the state does not have enough money for proper restoration. I have been working in this sector of monument protection for more than 25 years, and I see how badly and extremely slowly this system works. It's corrupt and deeply bureaucratic. The Ministry of Culture and the city authorities don't understand the comprehensive approach to restoration. Preservation specialists are simply absent at all levels of the state system. There is also a complete lack of economic interest in heritage at the state level. Therefore, in recent years, urban activism has become an important step in the preservation of monuments. Here in Kiev, we managed to save from destruction some interesting objects of different epochs and different styles, including architecture of modernism. Just some examples. The Ukrainian School of Restoration was born after the Second World War, when the state made great efforts to preserve the cultural heritage. But honestly, in recent decades, the field of restoration has gradually declined. Careful restoration does not bring such a profit as new construction. For the last 30 years, in Kiev, we can name only a few successful examples of professional restoration or adaptation of monuments. I have some examples. It's not Kyiv, it's Chernivtsi, but one of my favorite place, city. According to the Ministry of Culture, 80% of monuments in Ukraine needed restoration. To solve the problem, the government approved in 2021 the project Great Restoration, just before war. In 3 years, they planned to restore about 150 facilities to allocate more than 60 million US. In fact, the amount is not large. Another danger is the presence of an inconvenient legacy associated with a historical past that is being revived and re-evaluated today. Decommunization processes have been going on for a long time, actively since 2014. Today, the cancel culture of everything Russian is added. And this is a difficult question, more philosophical, whether this or that culture is guilty of historical crimes. Is Russian poet, writer, or artist from the past guilty of Putin's crime? Today, part of traumatized society believes so. So far, we are talking only about monuments and sculpture, but they also cannot be demolished in mass. We need to create appropriate museums of totalitarian art, for example. However, the negative attitude towards Soviet art may also affect the architecture of this period, because many beautiful buildings appeared during the Stalin's year, for example, Khrushchev. The next stage, the era of modernism, is not of great interest. It's poorly understood. Soviet modernism of the 1960s and 1980s, with synthesis of art, the widespread use of mosaics, ceramics, stained glass, and so on. This layer of art is hardly legally protected today. And in fact, many objects are simply being destroyed. And in the war zone, in the east and south of Ukraine, they are also being destroyed by shelling. In Kyiv, Lviv, and other cities, some monuments were covered with sacks, windows were strengthened, and some buildings. But it's impossible to save all buildings in such way. Today, 80 years after the Second World War, some cities are damaged or even destroyed in Ukraine. During the war in Ukraine, about 200 cultural objects were damaged, and the figure is constantly rising. Fortunately, Kyiv has not suffered so much. Its historic buildings and unique UNESCO monuments have not been damaged, but other cities were not so lucky, and I can show only some examples. So far, the Ministry of Culture has created a website that records lost and damaged cultural heritage sites, and a short questions was also developed. These questions allows us to visually assess the losses of buildings. The main fear of experts today is the rapid reconstruction of destroyed cities without taking into account their heritage. So professional discussions are already underway. How to rebuild the cities of Ukraine, how to make them better, modern, and comfortable to live. And even the world's great architects does not guarantee this. It's no secret that in the last 20-25 years, construction has often been chaotic, disrupting the urban structure and height, negatively interfering in the historic quarters. Today, we just hope that modern architects, developers, and government officials will work together and will not repeat the mistakes of our wild capitalism era. We are also looking forward to working with restorers from different countries, hoping to learn from modern practices. My colleagues, restorers, are already expressing a desire to learn and work together. It's also hoped that the damaged monuments will be restored in their original form, not just rebuilt. International financial assistance in this direction is also needed, but it's definitely better to focus on supporting specific objects of cultural heritage instead of the building and industry as a whole. Creative professional groups can be created around such facilities and always with control of state and charitable funds. Thank you.
So much, Elena. That was really moving, and the images came through really loud and clear to us here in London. If you would be so kind as to stop your screen share, and I will introduce Katarina Kobliska as she shares her screen. Katarina is a practicing architect and restorer in Kharkiv. She's Director of Architecture and Conservation for Portal 21, the architecture and construction firm, and a member of the NGO Urban Forms Center. Since 2017, she's been a member of the Save Kharkiv Initiative Group for the Protection of Cultural Heritage. And since 2018, she's been a member of the Advisory Council for the Protection of Cultural Heritage at the Department of Urban Planning and Architecture of the Kharkiv Regional State Administration. A laureate of the State Prize in Ukraine in Architecture, which she was awarded in 2011. She graduated from the Kharkiv State Technical University of Civil Engineering and Architecture. Please help me in welcoming Katarina.
Good evening, colleges. The topic of my report is immovable cultural heritage of Kharkiv and the issues of its preservation during the war between Russia and Ukraine. Kharkiv is one of the largest cities in Ukraine and the largest in the east of the country, more than 1.5 million people. The city dates back to the second half of the 17th century and has monuments of all important building eras and historical styles. Kharkiv was severely damaged during Second World War. After it was rebuilt, however, unfortunately, the city lost many elements of complex architectural sculpture which have not been restored. Now we can see them only in old historical photos. In the 2000s, lively construction began, including in the historical areas. Currently, Ukraine has a number of laws for the protection of cultural heritage. However, they rather protect in interest of the state and in no way encourage investors or developers to engage in restoration. Even before the war, reforms to this legislation, we already begin discussing among the professional community. As a result, at the time of February 2022, we had a large announced area of cultural heritage that needed careful treatment and valuable restoration. And investors who were not interested in going so. It is also worth nothing the irresponsible approach to restoration work by builders. They usually pursue the interests of investors or developers. In this way, we quickly lost the authentic details in the architectural monuments. On the morning of the 24th of February, the city was under constant fire. From February to April inclusive, the shelling was very intense. The enemy activity tried to destroy government quarters, medical infrastructure, and education institutions in the city. Government quarters and some medical infrastructure and educational institutions are located directly in historical areas and mainly in buildings that are architectural monuments. As a result, historical buildings, including those that are architectural monuments, have been hit by shells or blasts. I will now show you slides with the following buildings. Well, the first object is the Silva apartment building, was built for the Writers Cooperative in 1929. The building located near medical facilities and as a result also suffered from shelling. The cluster shell hit the lawn in the immediate vicinity of the entrance group of the house. Windows damaged to masonry and plaster were lost due to shrapnel. I show you small video with photo scan of masonry damage. Now we will be scanned destroyed objects and it's from me my experiment about 3D scan these details. The next object is the former government building is the People's Commissariat of Labor. Currently, it is the building of the Faculty of Economics of Kharkiv's National University. 1916-1927, still style Ukrainian architectural modern or Ukrainian style, nation style. The building was destroyed by several shells and blasts from nearly building. This building is located in the immediate vicinity of the government quarter. And next slide, please. Yes, it's a patio. Yes, fire department with a tower. The end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, red brick style. The building was damaged due to the effects of the blast waves. Shells flew near the building several times. Next slide. Administrative government building, construction 1915. Next. Its same object. The building was damaged by a direct hit and numerous explosive waves, very seriously damaged. But we hope they are will be restored. Next, please. It's some interior lifting and base of street lifting after bombing. That's all of the lifting. Okay. Well, next slide, please. Former apartment building of the insurance company Russia, 1916. The building was damaged as a result of a direct hit on the roof and the action of explosive waves. The neighborhood in which the building is located received several hits. I have some video, but I think they can't show. Yes. about this object.
Will, if we just go through the images and then we'll have a little video session at the end, I think that's safest. Thank you so much. These images are incredible, really. You almost don't need video.
Okay, okay. Well, next slide, please. It seems object in a patio. Next. And formerly private mansion, now a healthcare facility. The beginning of the 20th century, the building received a direct hit. As a result, the fire destroyed of the roof and caused significant damage of the interior. Next slide, please. It's epicenter. Next. It's after fire. It's destroyed to water. Next. It's a painting from ceiling. After this fire, we need very expensive restoration this paint. Well, next, please. This is us on surveys of affected historical buildings. We are currently working on recording the lessons and gathering evidence. Programs for temporary measures to stabilize historical building are also being implemented. At the same time, an advocacy campaign is underway to take care of these buildings and carry out restoration work in the future, rather than their physical demolition. We are now one step away from repeating the same mistakes that we made during the reconstruction of Kharkiv after the Second World War, when many buildings were not restored or radically changed. These actions at the time led to a pretty loss of the spirit of the place and our identity. We still have a lot to work to do. Next slide, please. And this photo from my family archive. In the photo, my grandmother and her college during the reconstruction of Kharkiv in the 1950s. Against the background of the building of the former People's Commissariat of Labor, and if I can, I mouse and show you each this building, but I can't. and the university building, it's biggest on horizontal building, former house of project 1930-1933. I hope that soon we will also pause on the buildings that are beginning restored. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina, again, for an absolutely heroic performance from Kharkiv. I mean, just really wonderful to have had you.